here. I'd like to, first of all, thank Dale for the opportunity to really speak before this group on this important topic and really make clear that as an organization who's been at the mission of Everglades restoration, a multi-billion-dollar state, federal environmental restoration program, the largest environmental restoration program in the world. We've been at this 27 years. As we learn more about climate change and sea level rise, we understand that really it's integral to our mission. Everglades restoration is largely about water and water infrastructure, and I'll talk about that in a few moments. But sea level rise and climate change also affect water and water infrastructure in this state, and I hope at the end of this presentation you'll have a much richer understanding of the interface between these issues, and I use this term interface not only for the grand sort of the political and multi-billion-dollar restoration program, but this battle is taking place out in the Everglades right now. This image on this slide here shows you the freshwater marshes, the sawgrass marshes of the Everglades, and those green tree islands you see dotting that landscape on the upper right-hand side. On the lower left-hand side, that's where the mangrove forests and the tidal flooding is increasing, and it's pushing landward. We have very clear evidence of this, and we also know that these habitats are changing in ways that we didn't anticipate. It's putting our ecosystems at risk, and it's also affecting our water supply. I want to just take a step back. Sarah mentioned this in her introduction, is that we started out as a science-based organization. The way Everglades restoration has moved forward was really driven by the state government through the South Florida Water Management District and the federal government, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And they have done typically what is politically driven, and oftentimes it's the projects and the decision making that is most favorable over short-term periods, and there's kind of a relevance here to climate change and just dealing with the easy stuff and not really addressing the more complicated long-term problems. And so we grew out of that as an organization to bring science to bear and to say that these are the projects that we need to move forward with. Politics aside, this is what the science says. So as a science-based organization, we put aside the politics to move restoration forward. And so we take that science and we use that to drive our policy priorities and our advocacy efforts in both Tallahassee and Washington, D.C., going back to getting the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan passed in 2000. You can see the picture there with President Bill Clinton when that was signed in 2000, and one of our board founders, Mary Barley, just standing there to his right. And the lower picture is a recent photo at Ocean Reef with Governor Ron DeSantis and several members of our board, and how we're working with his administration more recently to move the needle on Everglades restoration. Sarah also mentioned innovation and education. As an organization who's been at this for 27 years now, our board has recognized that we've been at this long enough that if we're not looking forward, if we're not focusing on educating the next generation, we're doing ourselves a disservice, because we're going to be repeating these conversations again and again. So we have a K-12 Everglades literacy program now that's in 21 school districts across the state. We've trained more than 3,000 teachers, and we reach about 100,000 students a year with this program that's still growing. So this is a very exciting area. We've also invested in water quality, clean water technologies, with a $10 million George Barley Water Prize that helps us to deal with phosphorus pollution at a global level. Phosphorus is a pollutant that's in fertilizer. It affects many of our waterways, Great Lakes, Everglades, internationally. It contributes to algae blooms, and so solving that problem is going to take new technologies that help us to remove these pollutants more cost effectively, and again, we've been addressing that throughout our history. So I want to talk about sort of the water management system from a global scale. If you were to look at Florida and visualize how water used to move across South Florida, it would be the image on the left. Water would start flowing as far north as Orlando, where Disney is, and it would make its way down the Kissimmee chain of lakes, down the Kissimmee River, filling up Lake Okeechobee. This 700 square mile freshwater lake would fill up and spill over to the south, and forming a 50-mile wide river of grass that flowed more than 100 miles down to Florida Bay and the Florida Keys. So this is a distance of 250 miles, a connected ecosystem driven by the 5 feet of rainfall we get in South Florida each year. On the right, this is the genius of the 1940s, where we had an economy that was driven by agriculture. It was driven by developable land, and most of that land was underwater. The only way to get at it was to drain the swamp. So they started with the diking of Lake Okeechobee in the 1920s following a couple of hurricanes, one of the deadliest hurricanes in our nation's history. Building a bridge across Tamiami Trail, US 41, connecting Miami to Naples and ultimately to Tampa, also blocked the flow into what would become Everglades National Park. So this current system now is plumbed in such a way that water is discharged to the east and the west. To the east, to the St. Lucie River, to the west, down the Caloosahatchee River. That is the water that used to go south. So they're getting too much water on both of those coasts. And at the southernmost end, this area down here is Everglades National Park. And that area doesn't get enough water. Now, when we're in an average year or a wet year, things are fine. There's enough rainfall to get us through. It's when we experience a drought that we start to see ecological problems take place in Everglades National Park and Florida Bay. And I'll talk about how that interfaces with climate change, because this is a very flat, low-sloping landscape we have here in South Florida, especially south of Lake Okeechobee. The slope of the landscape is less than 2 inches of a drop for every mile that you go south from the lake to Florida Bay, which is this body of water down here at the southern end of the ecosystem between the Florida Keys and the mainland. So with that low of a slope and reaching sea level at the end, with incremental rise in sea level, we're getting more of that seawater encroachment into this freshwater Everglades. And so we've studied this, and we understand more about how this pressure of saltwater moving in around the coastal Everglades is affecting the ecosystem. We also know how cutting off that flow of fresh water from the north has accelerated this saltwater intrusion into the coastal Everglades. So much so that we can go 10 miles inland from the coast, and we can see not only measurable tide in these freshwater areas, but we can see that the water levels in this freshwater marsh 10 miles inland track sea level rise at the Key West gauge station, which is one of our nation's longest running sea level gauges. And this is often used as a reference point for sea level rise, not only here in Florida, but across much of the Gulf of Mexico. So this red line is what's going on in the marsh. This blue line is what's going on at Key West, and they track each other perfectly. Now, I'd be remiss to not talk about sea level rise in urban landscapes, and we certainly experience that in South Florida. This is a time lapse. I'm going to play it again of flooding coming out of, let me rewind that. Flooding coming out of a canal and passing over a road. In fact, you can see a car zip by there. This is about 5 minutes of a time-lapse photo during a king tide event, and you can see that water just gradually encroaching across the road. Now, this plays out on an entire city and county scale every time we have king tide events, and these are much more frequent than they used to be historically. And so communities are dealing with this. There are infrastructure challenges related to everything from sewage treatment to electrical to water conveyance, even transportation. You can see cars driving around this saltwater as it's flooding the road. You don't want to get saltwater on your car. You know what that leads to, corrosion. Those are just minor issues, and you can see at this scale how we're adapting to it. Driving around it is a very simple way of adapting to this kind of flooding. Eventually you get to a point where the entire road's underwater, and then you get to a point where properties are flooded. And so as we move through this process, and communities are already dealing with this, decisions are being made about road raising. Decisions are being made about properties, whether to sell, whether to raise their home, whether to reconsider other forms of infrastructure. And so when people ask me, and I'm kind of going off on a tangent here, but when people ask me about what to do with respect to sea level rise, is it kind of a doomsday scenario? I just say that this is something that we have to adapt to like anything else in society. And over time, we'll see that our communities change and adjust to sea levels 50, 100 years from now, because we're going to have to. We're not going to abandon South Florida wholesale. This is just going to be a very different community, and the Everglades will be a very different ecosystem. Now, there's this group called the Southeast Florida Climate Compact, and this includes Palm Beach County, Broward County, Miami-Dade County, Monroe County, and they meet on an annual basis to discuss these issues at a pretty high policy level. And they also evaluate future scenarios of sea level rise, and these are their latest curves. This is what they came up with in late 2019, and it's just to kind of set the stage, and again, thinking that we have these very low lying and low sloping landscapes here in South Florida, and that's particularly the case with the Everglades. So by 2040, where we saw maybe 8 or 9 inches of sea level rise as a global average over the 20th century, by 2040, we're expecting to see maybe another 10 to 17 inches. So you can see an acceleration over what we saw as a rate in the previous century. And these rates are really difficult to nail down, and that's why there are multiple curves, and these projections are dynamic through time, because we're learning more about the different factors that contribute to sea level rise, whether it's warming of the oceans that causes them to expand, whether it's melting of ice caps and being able to predict when the big ones go. It's also understanding how forces like the Florida Straits, this oceanic river that moves right past us here on the Atlantic seaboard from south to north, as the rate of that current changes, we see the rate of sea level rise change at very small scales. If it slows down and water backs up coming out of the Gulf of Mexico, we see those rates can be extraordinary, as we saw in 2015 and 2016. Once that current picks back up again, we see that those rates decline pretty greatly. So there are local forces that contribute to our rates of sea level rise as well, and so that's why you can't apply a global figure to this. We really need to pay attention to the science and what's going on. So bringing this back to the Everglades and thinking about how this affects us, and flooding aside, it affects our water supply. The Everglades, the river of grass, this ecosystem south of Lake Okeechobee, it's not only a river of grass, but it's really a sponge. It's a mechanism for recharging the Biscayne aquifer that more than 6 million people in South Florida depend on for their water supply. So if you've ever been out to the Everglades in an airboat, if you've ever seen it from afar and you see water out there, that means that there's water in that aquifer. When it dries out, or when you see it burning, that means we're missing out on that water supply. So when we're often dumping water to the east and the west, we're really depriving our water supply, not only the environment of what it needs, but we're depriving ourselves of a future water supply. And I've got a few slides that that point that out. This green area, again, this is south of Lake Okeechobee. This green area demarcates the Biscayne Aquifer, that surficial aquifer that we all depend on here in the lower East Coast. This red box I'm going to highlight on is the downtown area of Miami. And this is just a couple of snapshots of how saltwater has intruded into that aquifer over about a 40-year, 50-year period of time. You can see 1904, it wasn't that great, just a narrow fringe along the coast, a little penetrating up into the Miami River. As we began constructing this flood control system, you can see that those canals became the path of least resistance. Saltwater began intruding further up into this flood control system, to the point where even as early as 1977, we saw pretty dramatic intrusion of saltwater into the base of the Biscayne Aquifer in these areas. And if you're familiar with where the Biltmore Hotel is in Coral Gables, I've got it located right here. So at the Biltmore, you're pretty far inland. But if you go down to the base of the Biscayne Aquifer at that point, you see saltwater. And it's because of this flood control infrastructure that we have in South Florida that's really caused so much harm. Those discharges from Lake Okeechobee to the east and the west, they're now polluted. They're polluted with phosphorus and nitrogen because of the land use changes north of the lake and because of the agricultural practices south of the lake that really just used the lake as a dumping ground for polluted runoff for decades. So the water that goes east and west is polluted with phosphorus. It often contains toxic blue-green algae. This toxin produced by blue-green algae is it's a neurotoxin. It's a hepatotoxin, meaning it affects the liver. There are concerns that it might have long-term degenerative problems. So we're just understanding more about these toxins that nature has really been producing and evolving for millions of years. That's the water that goes east and west. So not only are they getting too much fresh water, abnormal freshwater levels that impact oysters and seagrasses, but they're also getting this really nasty, toxic blue-green algae. And when we have a red tide event, as we did in 2018, the nutrients associated with these discharges are equivalent to throwing gasoline on a fire. The red tide events are just voracious masses of organisms that require nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus in particular, to survive. And so these discharges are only making that problem worse, as we saw in 2018, and some of you may have experienced when that water got entrained around the Florida Keys and wrapped up into the Florida current. It was on your back door, really in a matter of days. Same goes for these discharges going to the east, as we saw in 2016 in places like Stewart, Martin County, toxic blue-green algae there. So again, this is directly tied to those east-west discharges of polluted water. At the southern end of the ecosystem, where we're not getting enough fresh water, we see massive seagrass die-offs, sponge die-offs, simply because we're not getting enough fresh water to create an estuarine environment during drought years. And so ecosystems down there are going belly up because of a lack of water. And so all of these problems are tied together. And then when you add in the fact that we have sea level rise that's only intruding further into the coastal Everglades, it's making matters worse. Well, we understand that restoration is the solution. Everglades restoration, beginning with the Kissimmee River Restoration Project, probably one of the craziest things that we did was took a 100-mile meandering river and straightened it into a 40-mile canal in the 1960s. We're now going back, the same agency, the Corps of Engineers that was tasked with creating this 40-mile canal is now going back and restoring this ecosystem into the meandering river that it once was. And sure enough, we're seeing nature come back as resilient as we had anticipated we know restoration works. We have a number of other projects around South Florida that need to be built in order to get this project moving forward so we can protect our water supply, protect our waterways, and it's really the take home here, as I'll talk about briefly, is just the political will to get these things done. But the more we learn about climate change, the more we learn about toxic blue-green algae, we're seeing more momentum being made in this area. One of the key projects, I talked about Tamiami Trail earlier, that roadway across the River of Grass, the northern boundary of Everglades National Park. Raising that road, it's as simple as that, to allow the water to flow into the park and ultimately down to Florida Bay. But the thing to keep in mind is that these are expensive infrastructural projects. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars for individual projects, upwards of over $1 billion for a single project. And some of these projects that we need include multiple phases of billions of dollars of funding in order to get them built. But we know it's worth it. The key project to this is the Everglades Reservoir south of Lake Okeechobee. This is the project that allows us to reconnect the River of Grass to Lake Okeechobee. And the way it works is like a rain barrel. So if you imagine just building like a big barrel south of Lake Okeechobee to allow us to take water from the lake that we would otherwise be sending to the east and the west. We know that water is polluted, so we have to clean it. The state has invested more than $2 billion of taxpayer funding on stormwater treatment areas that allow us to clean that water so that it's not polluted before it goes into the Everglades. So we have the technology to clean this water before it goes into the Everglades so that we can flow it under the bridges and ultimately down to Florida Bay. And this single project, when it's built, $1.7 billion, will allow us to cut those polluted discharges to the east and the west by more than half and restore the flow of 120 billion gallons of clean fresh water back to the Everglades, back to Florida Bay. So not only are you reducing the harm on the east and west coast, you're providing the benefits all the way down and ensuring water supply for the future. So this is really the heart of Everglades restoration, is storing, cleaning, sending water south. The more we do that, the more we can cut those harmful discharges going to the east and west. And one thing that our elected officials are beginning to understand, and I say that because they're openly acknowledging it and they're putting their money where their mouth is in some instances, like Governor DeSantis, making this a priority. He recognizes that clean water in the state of Florida, and I know this is no surprise to any of you in this room, clean water is tied to the health of our economy. People come here because of the water. It helps that we don't have an income tax, but it really is about the water. Because you could go to Texas, and I lived in Texas, I love Texas, but let's face it, Florida is where it's at. And so the state's economists even pointed to this, that tourism-related losses are one of the biggest threats to the state's economy because they help to make our state run. So tourism is a huge industry. Protecting those amenities, whether it's real estate, clean water for boating, fishing, etc., is really at the heart of our economy. And Everglades restoration, as a result, we know pays big benefits in that area. We conducted an economic study that showed conservatively Everglades restoration delivers a 4-to-1 return on investment. Well, shifting now back to sea level rise and climate change and how this fits in, by sending more water south, we can slow down the impacts of sea level rise in this area. Again, we know these mangroves are moving landward and providing more fresh water, we know will help to slow that transformation that's playing out on a real-time basis and has been rather dramatic over the last several decades. But with climate change, we also have to recognize that we're experiencing warmer temperatures. With warmer temperatures, even with no change in rainfall, South Florida is going to be drier, just simply because more water is going to evaporate back out to the atmosphere. But we know that rainfall patterns are going to change. We're still focusing our efforts and understanding how that will play out. But more extreme droughts in the Everglades is a problem. And again, when you think that restoration is largely about storing water instead of wasting it and dumping it, we can provide for the needs of this ecosystem and protect these areas of the Everglades that are drying out all too frequently. Because when you think about the drivers of climate change, it's largely about carbon. It's about fossil fuel emissions. It's about increasing carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. These soils in the Everglades, millions of acres blanketed with carbon, carbon in the form of organic matter that these wetlands have accumulated over centuries to millennia. This carbon, if we were to left it there without draining 50% of the ecosystem, a million years from now would be coal. So that gives you some perspective on how our coal deposits were formed. It was formed by wetlands. But we're changing those cycles by draining these areas and losing these carbon reserves back out to the atmosphere. Some of you may have heard these terms, something like blue carbon. Blue carbon is just a very simple term that we use to describe this material tied up in coastal wetlands, whether it's seagrasses, whether mangroves, or tidal freshwater wetlands. This is basically partially decomposed plant matter that accumulates because of flooded conditions. When we drain the Everglades, we lose that carbon. It's lost back out to the atmosphere, and that's what we're seeing play out on a very large scale, because we have approximately 500 square miles of mangroves in South Florida, the largest area of mangroves in the continental US, 6,000 square miles of seagrass meadow. It's the largest seagrass meadow in the world that's been documented. And there's huge stores of carbon tied up in the plants, in the roots, below ground in these ecosystems. Globally, these blue carbon sources are enormous. They represent, if we were to scale it to terrestrial forests, think like boreal forests or deciduous forests, they represent 3% of the area, but they have an equivalent total amount of carbon stored in these ecosystems. So blue carbon reserves are enormous. Relative to the ocean, they represent about 0.2% of the oceanic area, but they represent 50% of carbon reserves across the entire ocean floor. So again, these are enormous carbon reserves. And what we're learning is that the degradation and destruction of these types of coastal wetlands represents a potential amount of carbon to be released back out to the atmosphere. So when we talk about protecting coastal wetlands, seagrasses, it's not just about the habitat value. It's also about keeping that carbon locked up in these ecosystems. In the Everglades, this is kind of an artist's rendering of what those soils would look like. It looks like a bunch of roots, and these plants accumulate those roots over time under flooded conditions. And the rate of accumulation is about 3 inches or so every decade, or give or take. So if we keep them wet, they grow vertically. If we dry them out, we can lose that amount of carbon within a month. So it's a very slow process. It's also a very unstable process that's driven by the growth of the plants relative to the decomposition of those plants. The key is keeping them wet. Wetlands need to be wet. And by depriving them of water, we can see a relatively rapid loss of soil elevation across the Everglades that not only affects the habitat, it leads to nutrient loss, and that contributes to algae blooms and, again, increasing atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. So this is at a small scale. Let's think about what's happened to the Everglades over the last century. We've lost 50% of this ecosystem. This map on the left shows the area estimated that was blanketed by these organic soils before we drained the Everglades and built the agricultural area. In some of these areas, the soils, this organic carbon stored in them, were more than 15 feet deep. down to the bedrock. So when we drain this ecosystem, when we cut it off from Lake Okeechobee, we lost 50% of the area, but we've also lost an enormous amount of carbon tied up in those soils. And it's the equivalent of about 700 million tons of carbon. So that's what we've lost from the Everglades. So when people ask, can Everglades restoration fix the atmospheric carbon dioxide problem? I said, well, that's what we've lost. So we at least have to recover that to get back to where we were. To put that amount into perspective, so the GT is gigaton, which is 1 billion tons. So we're talking 700 million metric tons here. Each year, we lose about 120 million metric tons of carbon just due to coastal wetland loss. So that's each year. The Everglades has been drained for about 70 years, 80 years, give or take. So still an enormous rate of loss. Put that into perspective. Each year, automobiles contribute about 2 gigatons of carbon per year to the atmosphere. So that's per year. That's 3 times what we've lost from the Everglades over a 70 to 100 year period of time. So it's just kind of putting these numbers into scale and then considering how slowly these ecosystems accumulate that carbon, sequester that carbon over time. So the simple conclusion is that restoration is not going to solve this atmospheric carbon dioxide problem. But what it can do is prevent the loss of more carbon from these soils by protecting what we have left, protecting our seagrasses, protecting our mangroves, protecting these sawgrass marshes across the Everglades. We're learning some new things. We're learning that some of these freshwater marshes aren't transitioning to mangrove. As sea level rise and saltwater intrusion moves into these areas, this Swiss cheese looking landscape is a result of saltwater invading a freshwater marsh, killing the plants, and resulting in rapid loss of soil elevation to the order of about 1 foot over the course of a decade. And this is what it looks like up close. That red arrow, this is about a 10-year-old sawgrass plant. That red arrow is about 1 foot length, and those are roots that are extending out from either side of the plant. So the soil loss around that plant has occurred within the last 10 years. We've lost 1 foot of elevation. Imagine, we're concerned about inches of sea level rise, and in the Everglades, we're seeing feet of soil loss in a very short period of time. And this is playing out. And we know, again, we need to deliver fresh water back to the ecosystem. This research that we've been conducting for a couple of decades now in partnership with scientists at Florida International University, Everglades National Park was picked up by National Geographic, and they covered this concept in their story of how the national parks will be affected by climate change long term. And the Everglades is really at the forefront of that, not only from sea level rise, but also in terms of how warming and changing rainfall patterns will affect it. This is going on in restoration planning today, understanding how the loss of these soils will be affected by Everglades restoration. What we have here is some modeling that was done by the Army Corps of Engineers in planning associated with one restoration project. And what they showed was that if we consider this concept of peak collapse or this really rapid soil loss, we get this scenario on the right where we could see seawater all the way up to Tamiami Trail with a 2 foot rise because we would lose that soil. Think of this again as a blanket of soil across the landscape, covering the bedrock. If we lose that soil, that only paves the way, literally, for saltwater to penetrate further inland. So again, this is evidence that we need to restore freshwater flow south. Well, the National Academy of Sciences gets it. They help us provide information to Congress on why Everglades restoration is needed. I won't go into detail, but every 2 years we get feedback from them that Everglades restoration is important for climate change. It helps to protect against saltwater intrusion. It helps to protect our habitats. It helps to protect our water supply, these things that I've been talking about. We know that without restoration, we're going to see continued discharge to both coasts. We know that that carries pollutants. We know that it fuels blue-green algae. It affects economies. It affects property values. That's going to continue until we can restore this ecosystem. We have increased risk to those blue carbon sources that I talked about already, accelerating saltwater intrusion further inland, leading to the collapse of those marshes. We know that under extreme drought, we get drying out of these soils to where they actually burn, and loss of habitat and carbon associated with them. On the contrary, we know that Everglades restoration will deliver the benefits we need to protect our water supplies, to preserve these remaining carbon sources and enhance the sequestration value that these natural ecosystems can provide. What's holding things up, you might ask? That's where we are today. And it transitions from a biological science story to a political science story. And the political science is pretty clear. It's about funding. When the Everglades Restoration Plan was passed in 2000, there was an agreement between the state and federal government that both parties would contribute $200 million a year, a total of $400 million for upwards of 20 plus years to complete these restoration projects. This red line is the $200 million mark. The dark green line is the state's contribution to this. The lighter green line is the federal government's contribution to this. So you tell me, who's living up to their end of the bargain here? The state's been doing the best job. They haven't been there every year, and we went through a period of time in the previous administration where we didn't get enough funding. What we're seeing now is Governor DeSantis and the effect that he's had on restoring funding to Everglades restoration, and then his relationship with the president to get him to match the federal side of that ledger. So we had $200 million for the first time in the previous 10 years from the federal government, and the president committed yesterday to $250 million for Everglades restoration. So we had news yesterday that in the president's budget that was unveiled, there's $250 million for Everglades restoration. And again, a lot of this goes back to Governor DeSantis, his executive order beginning last year in January, and his commitment to Everglades restoration, advancing projects like the Everglades Reservoir, establishing a blue-green algae task force, creating new positions like Chief Science Officer, Chief Resilience Officer, to help us address these problems moving forward, because they're only going to get worse if we don't focus on them now. Thank you.